Hey, hello everyone. Thanks a lot for being here. I'm very happy to be back at Nullcon to present our work on a UEFI malware firmware bootkit that we discovered in the wild this year. And this research was actually led by my dear friend and also former teammate Mark Leshtik, who now works at Mandiant. Unfortunately, he could not be here today with us, but it falls into me to hopefully do justice to his work. So before we dive in, I would like to start with a few definitions. It's not something that I usually like to do, but I do remember myself being a little bit confused when I really started doing work on this research, because there are a lot of slight differences between, Bootkit, Rootkit, Firmware, UEFI, etc., etc. So I think it's probably best if I first begin by giving a few definitions to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So first of all, UEFI, as opposed to legacy BIOS, is one of the technical standards that defines how components can participate in the startup of a system. So it is the most recent one, quote unquote, because it was introduced in 2006. And today, I would say that almost all devices support UEFI when it comes to the startup process. The key point there is when we say that when something takes place at the UEFI level, it really means that it happens way before, at the very early stages of the computer starting up and way before the operating system has itself been loaded. Now, the firmware is something else. It's a legitimate, most of the time, piece of code that is running on the hardware device, something like maybe a motherboard or a hard drive or something like this. Because, most of the hardware today is not just some, physical device, but it's also something that contains a rudimentary software component. And this component is going to help it start up and provide basic I/O operations and things like this. And in the words of a famous security researcher, if it's smart, then it's hackable. Now, a bootkit is a type of malware that infects the boot process on a machine in order to persist on the system. Now, while the terms are similar, a rootkit is a bit different. A rootkit is a piece of malware that runs in the deepest areas of the system. For instance, usually the kernel of the operating system. And it will leverage this strategic position to hide information, notably about its presence, to the operating system itself. And it will make its discovery super difficult. Now, this is where things get a little bit confusing because due to how low level they usually are, the bootkits are usually going to be rootkits as well, but they don't really have to be. So to sum it up, a rootkit may or may not be a bootkit, depending on where it is installed on the victim machine. And a bootkit may or may not be a rootkit as long as the infected component is used is for the system startup. And finally, the firmware is one of the components that can be infected by bootkits, but there are actually others as well. So today I'm going to be talking to you about one specific malware family that we worked on, and this one is called CosmicStrand. And this one happens to tick all the boxes here, so it is a malware that infects the boot process through malicious patching of the UEFI firmware of motherboards. So one of the things that I want to make very clear is that these types of malware are very interesting for attackers because they bring a super interesting capability, which is the fact that since they are installed not on the hard drive but on the motherboard and not on the OS but on the firmware of this motherboard, then it means that if the computer is reinstalled with a new operating system, well, as long as it's still Windows in this case, or if the user changes its hard drive and puts another one, then the computer is still going to be infected. It means that the malware infection can actually survive a OS reinstallation, which is a pretty powerful capability. So these types of low-level implants are actually pretty rare. A few examples of past malware like this are Moonbounce, for instance, that was discovered in January 2022. And this one was also a UEFI firmware bootkit that we attributed to APT41. I will briefly mention this one a bit because there are some slight similarities between this one and CosmicStrand. We also have a Mosaic regressor, which was discovered, I think, in January or, well, at least it was in 2020. It's another one. And then there are a few others who do not, I think, infect firmware. For instance, LoJax. I think this one was related to some Russian-speaking APT, probably APT28. We also have eSpectre or ESP Ector. I'm not sure. This one was not attributed, I think, but beyond strings that were in the Chinese language. And then you also have some commercial projects that come from either hacking team or Gamma Group. So this list may not be completely exhaustive, but I think it's close enough, and it really illustrates how rare this type of low-level malware really is. So it's really not widespread, and there are a number of reasons for this. The first one is that they are quite hard to develop compared to a traditional malware. If you want to write some userland malware, it's going to be pretty easy. You're going to find a lot of tutorials on the internet, and also well, it's pretty well documented, straightforward, so you will have a lot of examples. But when you want to write malware that is running in the kernel or even lower, like in the firmware or in the UEFI, then you will need a very good knowledge of the internals of the operating system, but also on the internals of the boot process itself, which is a bit more rare as far as skills come. They also tend to come with heightened risks, because when you are running so low level, then any bug is liable to cause very dramatic consequences. So for instance, if you have a bug in your program in the kernel, then when the program crashes, it takes down the whole system with it. You do get this blue screen of death screen that everyone is familiar with, I think. And then if you have a problem when you have a malware that is running at the boot level, then maybe there is even a risk that you're going to make the machine unable to boot anymore. So it's kind of a problem when you are an attacker and you're trying to be very stealthy. But in any case, this also means that when an attacker is going to such length in order to develop their malware, when stealth is so important to them, when persistence is so important to them that they are willing to go so deep in the system, they are willing to invest so much effort in the development efforts, then it means something, right? I'm not exactly sure what it means, but it's something that at least is interesting to us and that we need to investigate. So, when the firmware scanner component of our product reported a new, possibly suspect UEFI component, we of course looked into it. And maybe we can start talking about the prevalence of the malware itself. The number of samples that we found on this campaign is very low, actually, and this is something that is very interesting to us because it hints that we are dealing with a very targeted campaign. Or maybe a campaign that is active in regions where we don't have too much visibility, but I really don't think that it's the case here. So while we were not able to discover exactly how the victim machines were infected in the first place, an analysis of the hardware of all the victims that we could identify sheds light on the devices that CosmicStrand seems to be able to infect. The Rootkit appears to be located in the firmware images of two brands of motherboards, which are Asus and Gigabyte. And we all noticed that those images are related to designs using the H81 chipset. So we don't exactly know all the implications of this, but this might suggest that the attackers maybe have some vulnerability that allows them to inject their Rootkit into the firmware image one way or the other. All the implants that we have here introduce modifications in the existing benign CSM DXE drivers, and in that case, the entry points have all been patched in order to divert the control flow to a new region where the new code has been appended to the driver by the attacker. So I'm going to go back into this in more detail in a little bit, but the general idea there is that this new code that was added into the CSM DXE driver allows the attacker to trigger a very big infection chain, and the point is to pass control back to the original entry point of the driver then, and continue executing normally. And to us, This sort of design implies or might indicate that the attackers have prior access to the victim machines because it's probable that they are patching all those firmware images in a either automated or semi-automated way. So they take this firmware image, they patch the entry point, they jump to some code somewhere, run whatever they have to do, and then they jump back to the original driver code. So, yeah, we don't exactly know how they are able to do this initially, but it's possible that we do believe it's automated, or at least semi-automated, and this might require prior access to the machines because I kind of have trouble believing that it's something they could do directly from a computer remotely. But we'll talk about this a little bit later on. Anyway, let's now have a look at how this infection process works. I do intend to get into the details of every single of those parts there, but first I think it will be really easier if I can provide you with a quick overview of the overall process because it is quite convoluted. So to help make future explanations make more sense, and also if you kind of get lost in the explanations, hopefully having given you the big rundown first is going to help you get back on your feet later on. Because I don't expect that all these components are components that you work with on a daily basis. I know I don't. But anyway, the big challenge that Bootkit authors have to face is that their implant starts running so low in the system that it's so early in the boot process that the OS really hasn't been loaded yet when the UEFI firmware rootkit starts running. And so this is an issue for them because if they want to infect Windows and they are running at the time where Windows is not even loaded, then it means that they have to find a way to propagate their infection up to a point where Windows is actually running. And so, really, the big part of what CosmicStrand is doing is finding ways to push code down the execution chain, down the boot process, until it can find a time where Windows is loaded, and then it can infect it. Because, of course, when Windows will be loaded, then everything taking place at the UEFI level will have terminated execution by then. So really, the two do not exist at the same time, and this is the issue that they have to overcome. So this workflow really consists in setting hooks in succession, and this allows the malicious code to persist until the OS has finally started up. So let us break all these steps down. So the first step is the computer starts up, and here the UEFI gets invoked during the normal boot process. Yes. Close it. Like this? Oh, isn't it too loud for you guys? No? Okay. So first, during the boot process, the UEFI firmware will be invoked normally. And when that happens, then the malware will set up a malicious hook into the boot manager, and this will allow it to modify the Windows kernel loader as it is being loaded before it is being executed. And then when the Windows OS loader is executed, then this hook is being invoked in turn, and this allows the attacker to set up another hook function inside the kernel. And then during the normal boot process of Windows, this kernel function gets invoked at a later date. And then finally, this allows the malware to take control of the execution flow one last time. And when the malware does this, when it has finally reached the kernel, then it establishes connection to a C2 server and downloads some payload from the internet and executes it, and that's it. But in order to achieve this, it really needs to go through this whole very complex chain. So let's look at the details of how each of these steps is being performed. So everything starts there with an EFI driver. It appears to be a patch version of a legitimate one, which is called CSM Core. And this one is actually intended to facilitate the boot of the machine in legacy mode via the MBR. But the details of what it's supposed to be doing normally don't really matter. They chose to infect this one. And what they did here is they took this driver and they modified a service table somewhere to change a pointer to one of the functions, which is called handle protocol. And so in order to, instead of pointing to the legitimate handle protocol function, then it's going to point to some attacker code that, looks a little bit like this when it is uncompiled. So every time that this function is called, then it is redirected to this code that was supplied by the attacker. And what this code does here is it tries to determine which component has called it, because during the boot process, this function handle protocol is going to be invoked several times, but the attackers need to infect it during one of the specific calls. So in order to do this, what they do is that they examine the function arguments, and they also look at the bytes that are located at the return address. So this is what you see there. I'm not sure that it's super legible here, but in any case, the slides will be available, so you will be able to check on your own. So by checking the arguments and also the bytes at the return address, the attackers are able to figure out exactly which call is being performed to this exact function, and this allows them to select the one that they are looking for. So the reason why they chose one specific call to this handle protocol function is because at this stage, the boot manager is loaded in memory, but it is not running yet. So this is the perfect time for them to modify it, to patch it. So they do exactly that. They patch a number of bytes there that are located in a specific function, which is called the ArchPX64 transfer to 64-bit application ASM. Quite a mouthful. And this function is called later during the normal OS startup process. And it's also at a strategic time because by then the Windows OS loader will be present in memory and will be able to be modified in turn. So I think you're already getting the logic there, which is that they find functions that they can modify, and they choose those functions because they are running at a strategic time before the next component is run, but at least at the time where it is already loaded, so they can modify it. So let's go back to this ArchPX64 transfer to 64-bit application ASM function. When it runs with the hook that was set up, it locates another function that is inside the OS loader, and this function is called OSL Arc Transfer to Kernel. The way that they do this is that they look for a specific byte pattern. Doing this, they are able to locate this function and then add another hook at the end of it. And this is what is going on there. Again, not sure it is 100% legible, but the general idea is that they search for a byte pattern that is at the end of this function. And when they find it, they just add their own code at the end of the function. Now, this function wasn't chosen at random. It is called just before the execution is transferred to the Windows kernel. To the Windows loader, from the Windows loader to the Windows kernel, and this is a really traditional point for hooking when it comes to rootkits and bootkits. And now finally, when this final hook is being invoked, then CosmicStrand sets up a very last one to a well-known Windows function, which is called zwcreate function, zwcreate section. And the malicious code is copied into the image of ntOSkernel.exe. And then the first bytes of zwcreate section are overwritten to redirect to this new code that they added. So here I skipped a little bit of implementation details about shellcode tricks that are used in order to figure out exactly the address of the malicious code. It's a part that is a little complex, and you can find more details about it in our blog post. Anyway, at this point, they also make an attempt that is interesting because they try to disable a security function of Windows, which is called PatchGuard. So it's a mechanism that was introduced in order to prevent modifications in key structures of the Windows kernel. So exactly trying to prevent that kind of stuff. But of course, since this rootkit is running before Windows, it can kind of modify the memory of Windows to disable those functions. And here in this case, it locates a function in ntOSkernel.exe called keyFilterFiberContext. And it modifies it so it returns without doing any work. It's worth noting that the way that they locate this function is, again, through pattern search, but the patterns that they are searching are super exhaustive. What I mean is that they have patterns for a lot of very different versions of Windows. So they have different patterns for every specific subversion. It's not just Windows 10 and then Windows another server or etc. It's really for every subversion, like Windows Redstone 1 and Kratos Fall, etc. I think Kratos Fall was probably after this rootkit, but I mean, you get the idea. So it really shows that the attackers went really into the trouble and were very detailed oriented, because they took all the different versions of Windows and they made sure that they had the correct pattern to be able to locate this function. So anyway, at the end, the Windows kernel finally starts after all this work, and then it ends up calling this ZW create section function that was hooked while running normally. And when this happens, then finally CosmicStrand gains control of the execution one more time. And what it does, it restores the code of ZW create function, ZW create section. And then finally, it creates some sort of shellcode functionality that you usually see in this type of execution context. So they try to locate all the API functions that it needs. It tries to create a sort of import table. And then finally, they map a shellcode somewhere in memory, and they run it. And here, we are almost done, because all the steps that I mentioned so far had only one purpose, and this one purpose was to start from UEFI and go through all the steps until they could one way or another reach the Windows kernel. So this is where this job is actually kind of over. So this part there is the very first malicious component, actually malicious component of the chain so far. So this shellcode loader is going to set up a thread notify routine, and this gets invoked every time a new thread is created in Windows. And what this shellcode is doing is it waits until it gets a new thread creation from winlogon.exe. And then when they do, they know that they are in a high privilege context, and this is when they run their own code. So all this, basically just a way to propagate execution until the OS is properly loaded. Now, when this is done, CosmicStrand sleeps for about 10 minutes and tests the internet connectivity of the machine to make sure that it can finally talk to its C2 server. And interestingly, CosmicStrand does not use the high-level API functions to talk to the internet. What it does is it interacts directly with the transport device interface. So it's kind of interesting. What they do is they generate all the IRPs, which are kind of the IO request packets, manually by hand, and then they pass them directly through IOCTLs to the TCP or UDP device object. So really the lowest level I think you can have in order to generate the network traffic. Now, once they are able to establish connections to the outside world, they are going to try to contact the C2 server. To do so, they use two DNS servers, either the Google one or another one, this one 222.222.67.208. This one I'm going to talk a little bit about later. But overall, they find the IP address of their C2 server, which is hard-coded. I think, it's here. It's update.boct.com. And then they try to send a magic packet to that server, preferably over UDP, but if it's not available, then through TCP. And then they expect to get a reply from the C2 server that can come in many chunks of 528 bytes. And they follow the structure represented here. So with a checksum, a number, I think an identifier for the chunk, and so on. And then all these chunks are reassembled into a series of bytes. So everything is being reconstructed in memory. It's mapped into kernel space and interpreted as a shellcode. So all this complex framework that I was describing up to now actually has one single feature, and that feature is contact the internet and download the shellcode and execute it. So, it's really like one single feature, a very simple feature, but actually all the development efforts went into going from like the very bottom of the OS, from the boot process up until the kernel there. So all that work to accomplish just one thing. So unfortunately, we were not able to obtain a copy of this payload that is obtained from the C2 server. However, we have found some user mode component, some memory, some sample inside the memory of the victim machine that we could study and that we believe is related to this malware. So we do not know if this is exactly what was downloaded from the C2, but we have an infected machine where CosmicStrand is running, and then in the memory of that machine we find this malware. So we think CosmicStrand was the thing that brought this thing on the victim machine. And this one is super simple. It's actually just a short executable that runs a few command lines in order to create a new user, which is called AAAABBB on the victim machine, and it just adds that user onto the local administrators group. So we can infer from this that probably the shellcodes that are received from the C2 server, one way or another, are used to, or might be stagers that just recover attacker-supplied P executables, and probably many others exist. So this is probably just one example, but I definitely expect that more P executables could be provided by the C2 server there. Now, another thing I can mention at this point is that we found another variant of this malware. We actually have two variants, one which is a bit older and this one. And they really only have minor differences. The major one is that they rely on two different C2 servers. And beyond that, the older variant has a bit more debugging information that is left inside and some other minor differences. So we are aware of two C2 servers, one for each variant. And according to passive DNS information that is available for them, these domains have had a very long lifetime, at least in the malware world. Well, usually these campaigns tend to be quite short-lived. So we looked at the time frames where these domains have been active, and actually outside of the times where these domains were active, then the malware would be absolutely inoperant. Like, it would still go through all the startup phase, it would load the shellcode into the kernel, and then it would try to contact the C2 server, but the C2 server wouldn't be there, so it just would do nothing, and then the computer would just start normally. So this tells us that the victims, or that the campaign had a quite narrow scope, I think, in the sense that either there were very few victims per C2 server, or there are actually very few victims overall, despite all those major development efforts. It is very interesting for us to note that while the attackers opted to deploy this extremely persistent implant, the actual exploitation of these victim machines is very, very short, only a few months. And it's possible that these domains were actually reactivated on occasion, and that they were reactivated for so little time that this information was not recorded by passive DNS services. So maybe, occasionally the attackers needed to push more executables to the victim machines. They enabled their DNS they just reset the DNS server for a few days or something like this, and then when they were able to push their new malware to the victim, then they just turned it down again. And this is something we might not be aware of. But overall, if you look at the timeline representation of this data, I think it raises more questions. You will notice that there is a 3-year gap between the activity periods of the two domains, so between variant 1 and variant number 2. And it is possible that during this time, the attackers were controlling the victim machines through other means, like they don't really have to use this inefficient bootkit that only executes one thing every time the computer starts, but I would expect that in the meantime they would deploy some other type of malware and they would use that to control the victim machines. But still, it is very likely that other variants and C2 server exist somewhere and that we do not know about them. We are also unaware of any activity from CosmicStrand that would have taken place from the middle of 2020 up to today. By the way, we discovered as we were working on this research that researchers from Kihu 360 had actually identified this old variant that I just mentioned back in 2017, so props to them. Now, in their initial report, they indicate that a buyer or a customer of them might have received a backdoored motherboard after placing an order on a second-hand reseller. So some guy went online, they bought a motherboard online, and when they received this motherboard, it's possible that it was pre-installed with CosmicStrand. So of course we are unable to confirm this information, but I think it's very interesting because it hints at a possible attack scenario, for which we have no idea at the moment. We do not know how CosmicStrand ends up on the machines, but I think that this possibility here is very consistent with the attack scenario that we are aware of, because, well, this is pure speculation here, but such a complex infection chain really doesn't make sense unless you do not have access to the full machine, right? You would only go through all this mess, I would assume, if you have access to the motherboard at some point, but, do not have access to the full computer. So here, this would be a scenario where someone orders a board online, a motherboard, and then, somewhere the parcel gets intercepted, then the motherboard is backdoored, and then when the person plugs the motherboard inside the computer, then even if they have an OS that is already installed, when they start the computer, then their new, their OS that they used to have, which was plugged on this new motherboard, becomes infected. Because otherwise, I think odds are you can find much simpler ways to infect a machine. So let's talk a little bit about the victims. We were able to identify victims of CosmicStrand in China, Vietnam, Iran, and Russia. And one point of interest there is that all the victims in our user base, at least, appear to be private individuals. What I mean by this is that all the telemetry information that we got is associated with licenses that are related to free versions of Kaspersky antivirus. And this is typically associated with individual users, like corporate users. They will have those big licenses and support programs and support plans and so on. So we don't really know what it means, but one thing that it entails is that we are unable to tie any of those victims to any organization, and even less to an industry vertical that would be common to them. So this is a big mystery of the CosmicStrand investigation. Again, it looks like a whole lot of work to just infect a few individual users. So we don't really know what this means. We also cannot attribute this set of malware to a specific threat actor at this point, but however, there are a few hints that in CosmicStrand suggest that its developers are either Chinese-speaking or made use of previously shared resources among Chinese-speaking threat actors. So, for instance, we have particular code patterns that exist in almost identical form between CosmicStrand there and also a crypto mining botnet, which is called MyKings, and it was researched by Sophos. And in Sophos' analysis, there are a number of artifacts in Chinese language left in the MyKings botnet that could indicate that the MyKings botnet could be from Chinese-speaking threat actors or origin in that region. So the particular sections that are very interesting in terms of code similarity are related to a very, well, not very, but it's quite unique ROR13 based name hashing algorithm. So this is what you see here on the screenshot, and basically I'll show you the equivalent Python code in the next slide, but this is just some simple code that the attackers use in the kernel to be able to hash API names and figure out exactly, recognize all the functions that they need. Anyway, there are also additional similarities between the two malware families, which are that MyKings also makes use of a Bootkit in order to establish persistence and evade detection. It also contains kernel code that conducts tagged allocations, and it uses the same names when it's doing pull allocations, which are proc and getM. So interesting, it might indicate that they use some of the same code in order to develop this part of the program. And finally, this MyKings botnet also contained similar code that was doing all those network requests manually with IRPs and directly passing packets into the TCP or UDP drivers. So this hashing algorithm that I mentioned in the previous slide has never been observed in other instances of malware, with a few exceptions. The first one is Moonbounce, which is another UEFI firmware bootkit that I mentioned in the introduction. And the other one is Xtorker. And both of these malware were purported or actually exhibited signs that they could be linked to Chinese-speaking attackers. there are, I think, other similarities there, but generally, this is a variant of the ROR13 hash, and the difference between this algorithm and the traditional one is that here, the plain ROR13 hash goes through another iteration at the end. So this is a bit different from the normal algorithm that most attackers are using. Another very low confidence element that we have that might be tying this campaign to Chinese-speaking attackers is that, if you remember, one of the DNS servers that is used by the malware, the one of them was from Google, and the other one, which was a 222.222.67.208, is actually located. It's an IP that is owned by China Telecom. So this is a very low confidence sign, but there it is. So let's sum up all the various mysteries that we have left so far. So how did the malware end up on victim machines? We don't really know. We don't have that information. Based on the report from Kihu, it's possible that this was installed through a physical supply chain attack. I think this is the most likely scenario there. And that would actually explain why we have so few malware samples, because, deploying those types of attacks is going to require a little bit of work, like way more work than a massive infection, obviously. Why did this malware family disappear for 3 years? Now, this is something we really don't have an answer for. Maybe there is some activity that we missed because we don't have visibility, since this is such a small and targeted campaign. Or maybe the attackers just had no activity during this time frame because they were using other tools to control their victims. We don't really know there. Who are the victims? We don't know, individual users, but what is the connection between them? Again, no answer on this one. And finally, who is behind these attacks? We do not know, but these unexplainable links with the Chinese-speaking cybercrime ecosystem through the MyKings botnet are actually puzzling. And in fact, we cannot even say that this CosmicStrand attack is, we can say whether it is financially motivated or whether it aimed at collecting intelligence. So this is another thing that we do not know. What we do know, however, is how to disinfect machines infected with CosmicStrand. It's a question that comes up a lot when we talk about it. The short answer is that probably reflashing your motherboard would be enough. Blocking the C2 domains would also make the malware innocuous, because it would not be able to get additional components from the internet. But, well, in theory, though, when the infection runs that deep, you are in trouble. While this is not the case here, any of the CosmicStrand samples that we have encountered, I can imagine some firmware implants that would be able to detect that a firmware update is taking place and actually prevent it from actually running while still reporting that it went through. So, overall, I think the only way that you can ever be sure that you have removed a firmware bootkit from your machine is to just throw away the computer and buy a new one. Also, there is no way to say whether the attackers might have installed additional components through this bootkit in the first place. So overall, this computer is going to take a long time to disinfect. Actually, if you do think you've been infected with CosmicStrand, I think probably get in touch with us, because we'll be very interested in this, and I'm pretty sure I can convince my management to give you a free computer in exchange. Anyway, the discoveries that were presented today show you that the deployment of UEFI implants had actually started way before the UEFI firmware attacks were publicly described. So it suggests to us that UEFI firmware has long been considered to be a viable infection target that allows culprits not only to conduct very highly persistent attacks, and also very stealthy ones. So this is something that is very interesting, because these CosmicStrand infections have been active for a very long time. The first time they appeared, as far as we know, was December 2016, and we saw them up to July 2020, and they raised very little alarms in between. So 4 years like this, I think, is a pretty long time when it comes to malware, especially malware remaining mostly undiscovered. And this is definitely a blind spot that our industry needs to address sooner than later. Now, while this cluster that we have described here has been long-standing and running for several years, it is also very hard to determine whether it is still active. It may pop up again in 2 or 3 years. We do not know. But we estimate that it's very likely the attacker has other infrastructure and other implements that we have not been able to discover. So probably there is more CosmicStrand activity out there. And the final question I would like to leave you with is this one. If this is what these attackers had in 2016, what do they have now? That's something that worries me a lot. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this talk. And yeah, I'm available here at the conference or to take some questions whenever you like. Yes. Yeah, so secure boot, right? Actually, as far as I know, secure boot is not able to verify the integrity inside the firmware of the different components. So here, based on where this infection is located, secure boot would not be able to protect you. What might be able to protect you would be TPM, I think. TPM will be able to... yeah. Exactly. One thing I'm wondering, though, is that if we are talking about a scenario where attackers intercept your motherboard in transit and then modify it, is there a way that they could re-modify the TPM or re-flash new keys inside of it? Probably. This is really something that's going to be very difficult to protect from. I think if there is no network connection, then the malware does nothing and just waits until the next time the computer boots. So the persistence is a bit weird that way. They don't have any scheduling mechanism. What they do is when the program starts, it boots, they get some shellcode in the kernel, and then they wait 10 minutes and they try to execute whatever they get from the C2 server. If it doesn't work, they try next time. Yeah. From a what perspective? I don't recall that there were any particular anti-reverse engineering measures inside this malware. The simple fact that it's running from UEFI to through the whole boot process makes it it requires a bit of theory and a bit of knowledge from the reverser anyway, which is probably protection enough. So they did not add any obfuscation or anything like this. Just, the workings are complex enough that it was super hard to look into it. So you mean, why don't we have more UEFI firmware bootkits? Well, why don't we have that many samples? It's a very good question, and this is something I can only speculate about. We think that it is a very small campaign. We don't think that there are that many samples out there, although, of course, it's obvious that we are missing some. But overall, it's a good question. Yeah, we don't really know where the missing samples are or how many there are. We cannot map this to any sort of victims. We only know that this affects individual users, and we do not know what industry they are part of. No, nothing high profile. They are targeting users that are individual users, but we don't know who they are, and we don't know why they are being targeted. Very relevant. They were the first ones to discover this malware family, and we rediscovered it later on. But they did their own initial investigation on this and were able to find some information as well. But I don't think they had much more samples than we did. Yeah.
Just two questions. The first question is there any research going around prevention and detection for these kind of Bootkit? Or as a layman, how will I figure out that I'm infected?
So, figuring out that you are infected is super difficult. I think probably you would have a better chance reflashing your motherboard just out of precaution. Some security solutions are able to detect this. I know that we at Kaspersky added a firmware scanner component to our product, which is able to go look for these things. I'm pretty sure that other vendors will have similar protections or similar options. But if you want to do it manually, good luck to you. As far as antivirus is concerned, I think it's only for Windows.
So there was a slide where you showed prevalence, like it targets H81. So I can also see some other ones like N61 and E85. Is that the same chipset, or how was it attributed to H81 specifically? Because I can see some other.
I think that when you look at the design sheets for these motherboards, they all end up having this H81 chipset. I think this is why we figured it out. So yeah, sorry. This is actually all the time we have, so I'm getting kicked out of the room. But feel free to come ask me questions outside. I think I have a bit of time, and then I have to follow up with an interview. That's not so, this conclusion. This is all the infections that we are aware of, and the telemetry comes from our user base, and this telemetry says that these are the motherboards that correspond to these infections. That's it. And then we looked at the data sheets for each of those motherboards, and this is the common point between them.
Thank you, Ivan, for the insightful session.